Okay, today I'm going to go through this slideshow on tobacco, indentured servants, and slavery in Jamestown and the development of slavery in North America. So what we need to know is we need to be able at the end to define the Middle Passage. We need to be able to explain the conditions on the Middle Passage. And this will primarily do through the reading assignment that we'll do that accompanies this slideshow. We're going to explain how the practice of race-based slavery led to the forced migration of Africans to the American colonies. And we're going to describe the contributions of enslaved and free Africans to the cultural and economic development in different regions of the colonies. Today, we're focusing primarily on the economic development. So we talked about Jamestown, and one of the things we need to remember is that a colony only exists in order to make the mother country money. And so if Jamestown is going to survive, they're going to have to find a way to make money. And they struggled back and forth a long time, but in 1612, John Rolfe develops a high-grade tobacco that makes the Jamestown colony profitable for the Virginia Company. There had been tobaccos prior to this, but this variety of tobacco that Rolfe brings to Jamestown grows incredibly well in the Virginia soil, and it is incredibly popular in Europe. So this is something that they can grow well, they can grow easily, and they can make a large profit off of it. So one of the things that happens is that because the Jamestown colony is basically established by the Virginia Company, the people who live in Jamestown are technically employees of the Jamestown Company. And as the Virginia Company, and as the Virginia Company gets wealthier, the colonists who are working start to demand that they should have a share of the profits. And the Virginia Company doesn't like this. So they said, well, listen, we're not going to give you a share in the profits. But what we will do is we'll give you your own land. And so the Virginia Company offers 50 acres of land for each man, woman, and child who paid their way to the colony. And then they can make a profit off of that land. So the population of Jamestown is going to skyrocket because of this. And one of the reasons that we're going to see this is the function of tobacco, or one of the things that's going to develop is the need for workers is this tobacco situation. So tobacco is a very labor-intensive product to grow. The plants require what's known as worming, weeding, topping, and suckering until harvest time. So if you can kind of see your tobacco plant here, right? This tobacco plant has a flower on it. Your tobacco plant should not flower. So someone should have topped this, snipped the flower off of it because it ruins the flavor of the tobacco. Tobaccos have something called tobacco worms that grow on it, and you get holes in your tobacco. The more blemishes you have on your tobacco leaf, the less money it's worth when you sell them. And the other thing that happens is that you can see these tobacco leaves here, you want as large a tobacco leaf as possible. They are graded by the size of their leaves. So in theory, what I want is a large flat tobacco leaf with no holes in it and no blemishes on it. And then of course you have to weed it just like any crop. And so what happens when you farm tobacco is you have to go through these rows every day, and you have to take the little teeny leaves off to make sure that you get big leaves. You have to pick the worms off, and you have to pick the top off. And so that requires a lot of workers. And the Virginia colony does not have a lot of workers. And so they need to find a way to get more people to work. And so the first thing they try to use is they try to enslave Native Americans. But one of the problems you have is that Native Americans, since they don't have the same immunity profile as Europeans, if they lived and worked in close proximity with the Europeans, they tended to get sick and die. And the other thing that happened was that they simply ran away. Native Americans knew exactly where they were. And so if they decided they didn't want to be on the tobacco plantation anymore, they would leave. And they knew how to escape, and they knew how to find shelter. Whereas the Virginians were very unfamiliar with the land, and so that became something that they couldn't really control. So the first labor force we see used are indentured servants. An indentured servant is someone who sells their labor in exchange for passage to North America. They sell their work in exchange for a trip to North America. And so why would I do that? Why would I essentially agree to enslave myself for a period of time? And the answer is I can't afford to pay for my ticket to North America. The average cost of passage to North America was a year's salary for the average worker. So I can't save a whole year's salary to try and get to North America. That's just financially going to be impossible for me. After I pay for my food and my house and my clothing, I can't save a whole year's salary, especially if I'm poor, which most of these people coming to North America are going to be poor at the time. And so the indentured servants decide if I'm going to indenture myself, it would be worth working for free for a period of time in order to get to North America. Because once I got there, I have the opportunity to buy land and to establish my own wealth, where I'm never going to have that in England. And so they feel that the opportunity, the pull in the Americas would be worth the time period where I wouldn't make any wages. So one thing we don't often think about is just how many people are coming to North America as indentured servants. Of the 500,000 immigrants who migrate to the United States or North America by 1775, 350,000 come to North America as indentured servants. Over half of the people who settle in North America from England or other places in Europe come as indentured servants. So it is the most common way I'm coming to North America. Most of these are going to show up in the southern colonies because of the need for labor that exists as a result of the plantation economy that develops, but some are going to show up in the northern and middle colonies. So the question then becomes, how long am I going to indenture myself? So the average time for an indenture is 4 years and 8 months, but indentured periods could be as short as 3 years or as long as 8 years. And the variation in indentures comes because of the laws of supply and demand. Workers that had highly valuable skills and characteristics that made a good worker signed shorter contracts. Workers who had less desirable skills signed longer contracts. And this was just a process of negotiation between the person who was indenturing themselves and the ship captain who was purchasing the indenture. When you indentured yourself to the ship captain, or you indentured yourself to a contractor who was on the ship. And then that contractor would sell your indenture contract to someone who needed laborers in North America. So if I were a strong young man and I wanted to go to the Virginia colony and they knew that I could farm acres of tobacco efficiently and quickly and not get sick, I might sign a shorter contract than an older woman, because that person is not going to produce as much work as the younger man. So we really need to look, when we think about why is that difference so much between 3 years and 8 years, how much work can that individual produce? And the more work you can produce, or the more valuable work you could produce, the shorter your indenture contract is going to be. Eventually what we see is that we stop using indentures. I feel like okay, good. I missed a page there. Right. So why, if we have this indenture process, do we see eventually a transition to slavery? And that's because as traveling to North America became quicker, as traveling to North America became less risky, and as it became more efficient, the price of your ticket, passage is what we'd call it, goes down. So as the price decreases and I'm able to save enough money to pay for my own ticket, I'm less likely to indenture myself. I wouldn't give up my labor for free if I could save the money. But the problem means that we still need a labor force in North America, because indentures who come over are going to get their freedom after a period of time. And so you're constantly having to replenish those indentured servants. You're having to replace them. So then we see the use of African slaves. So the first enslaved African is going to arrive in Jamestown in 1619. And that day is an important one to keep in your mind, because if we remember from yesterday's lesson, Plymouth isn't established until 1620. So if we're looking at a timeline of development, the first enslaved African is going to be in North America before the first pilgrim is going to be in Plymouth. And the use of African slaves is going to increase as the need for more laborers increase. Africans are going to be preferred over enslaved Native Americans because as residents of the Eastern Hemisphere, they have the same immunity profile as Europeans, so they're not going to die of European diseases. Many Africans had been farmers, so they're familiar with cultivating the land in the way that Native Americans and sometimes even indentured servants who had lived in larger cities in England were unfamiliar with. And finally, Africans had no knowledge of the land or friends or family to help them escape. If I've come from Africa and I'm in North America, I have no means of getting back home. There is no place for me to escape to. And so I have very little options. So when we talk about North American slavery and colonial slavery, it's important we realize the characteristics of colonial slavery that might not have existed in slavery in other parts of the world and other times historically. And the first one is that this is an enslavement for life. The second one is slavery in North America is an inherited position. Right? So unlike other forms of slavery that you might have had in ancient Rome and Greece, if my mother is a slave, I am a slave. Slavery is passed down from the mother to the child. And lastly, this slavery is a race-based slavery. American slavery that develops in the English colonies develops based on the European colonial belief that people from non-European countries were inferior. That based on their race, the people of the continent of Africa were inferior to Europeans, and that justified the enslavement. So as the economic dependence on slavery grows, and tobacco grows, then the rules and the laws that restrict the rights and freedoms of Africans start to become more significant, and we start to see more of them in order to maintain that control. Because the way you can profit off of that tobacco is that you have an enslaved population or you have cheap labor. And we did not have enough people in North America to provide cheap paid labor. So we developed slave labor in order to make tobacco profitable. So the journey across the Atlantic Ocean from Africa to the Atlantic Ocean is known as the Middle Passage. And we'll look at a map in a second here that shows why we refer to it as the Middle Passage. It was a horrific journey, and we will read a passage, a primary source document from someone who experienced the Middle Passage tomorrow in class. So our trade triangle looks like this, and it starts from kind of a different series of points, but it makes it easiest if we kind of start from our North New England colonies over here, right? Boston, Philadelphia, our northern English colonies in North America. And so rum and iron and gunpowder, cloth and tools are being shipped to Africa. And these are being traded either for prisoners of war or we're just simply kidnapping enslaved Africans. But sometimes they're trading for them, right? And so we're trading these goods to the African nations. And then in exchange, these traders, these merchants who have the ships are then picking up slaves. And then our slaves are going first to the West Indies. In the early colonial period, slavery does not make it directly. Most slaves are not making it directly to the English colonies up here in North America. They're on the islands of the West Indies. And so on the West Indies, these enslaved people are being used to produce sugarcane in this case. And so we're producing sugarcane, sugar, and molasses. And so then the sometimes ex-slaves, we'd pick up more slaves, and then we trade the sugar and molasses, and these things would go to back to North America, to the New England colonies. And some of the slaves would go too. And then that sugar and molasses was then turned into rum in many cases. And so then the rum is going to Africa. And this is how it gets sort of that name Middle Passage, because it becomes a triangular trade, right? The rum and gunpowder and cloth and tools go to Africa in exchange for slaves. The slaves go to the West Indies, where they produce sugar and molasses, and that sugar and molasses goes to the New England colonies, where that sugar and molasses is converted into rum, which is traded. So if we look, it's rum to Africa, slaves to the West Indies, sugar to the New England colonies, and it's on a cycle. It is important to note that the slave traders, the people who are making the money and the profits off the buying and selling of the slaves, are not in the southern colonies where the slaves live, right? There is not large amounts of slave labor in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia for simply geographic and economic reasons. And then here we have that laid out. We're just going to go through this, and we'll have another where you can print it out, right? But when we look, how was slavery involved in the economy of the colonies, and how was it involved in trade with England? Right. Okay. There we go.